Hello everyone, my name is Afifa. Could you just type in the chat box if you can hear me? That's good to hear. Sounds like you guys can hear me. All right, so we can go ahead and get started right on time here. Hello everyone, my name is Afifa and I am the first year Global Regulatory Affairs Fellow at Sanofi Genzyme. The program that I'm in is within the MCPHS University Biopharmaceutical Industry Fellowship Program. And today I will be presenting you with some introductory information on regulatory affairs. Hopefully I'll be able to help you all build a general understanding of what regulatory professionals do, the different areas we work in, some of the projects I've been able to get involved with, and also answer your questions. If at any point you are unable to hear me, please just message in the chat box so I can respond accordingly. Or if my voice gets too quiet or whatever, it may be, just let me know. So without further ado, I'll start with a standard disclaimer, which is that although I am a Sanofi Genzyme Fellow, the contents of this presentation are intended to only be informational and they do not represent the views of Sanofi Genzyme. So before diving into regulatory affairs, our day-to-day, I'd like to provide a little bit of context through history to demonstrate why the pharmaceutical industry is so closely regulated and why regulatory professionals now play such a central role in the pharmaceutical industry, why regulatory professionals are so integral and pivotal in working with different functional groups and liaising with different health authorities. So I'm sure that all of you are pharmacy students. You probably have had some exposure to these historical contexts, and you probably are aware of some of the words on this slide. But just a little bit of a refresher to tell you. We'll start in the early 1900s. So in the early 1900s, Congress had been pushing back on overseeing food and drugs for over 20 years. It was not really an area that the government wanted to be involved in. They didn't want oversight. In general, government wanted to stay hands-off and give the power to the states. However, exposés began coming up and novels such as The Jungle came out, which resulted in absolute uproar from the public regarding the environment in which food and drugs were being produced and the sale of fraudulent and potentially poisonous medications. So this uproar and additional members within the White House led to the establishment of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So this act is what made it unlawful for manufacturers to sell, transport adulterated, misbranded, or poisonous medications. This legislation, however, only outlawed false statements related to the identity of the ingredients of the drugs. So it was still completely okay for manufacturers to make fraudulent claims about the health benefits of a drug until 1912 when the Shirley Amendment was passed. At this time, though, if you're thinking about the legislation, you really can tell that drug companies still don't have to prove that they have a safe or efficacious drug under here. The only thing that is illegal is that you can't have anything related to the identity or make false health benefits about the drug. So there's still a lot that manufacturers can get away with. And so by the 1930s, it was widely recognized that the 1906 legislation was obsolete and largely inadequate. FDA pushed Congress for a total rewrite of the 1906 Act, but it wasn't until the unfortunate sulfonamide elixir tragedy that Congress produced a new system of drug regulations under the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So under this act in 1938, these drug companies were required to demonstrate safety prior to sale, and factory inspections were also created, and the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, was granted oversight over the advertising of all FDA products except prescription drugs. Moving on, many of you probably learned about the thalidomide tragedy in school that struck globally in the 1950s. So some background that you might not know: thalidomide was the only non-barbiturate sedative at the time, and it came out in the post-war era. So many people were utilizing tranquilizers and sleeping pills to help themselves cope. So in Germany, thalidomide was actually advertised as an OTC remedy, completely safe for absolutely everyone and anyone, from mothers to children, and it was said that there wasn't a high enough dose to kill a rat. And the sale of this product, it was so popular that it matched the sales of aspirin. So around the same period of time, I believe around 1957, an OB in Australia recognized that there was an off-label effect being observed in pregnant women, that thalidomide was able to alleviate morning sickness, and he began recommending it in pregnancy. Quickly thereafter, however, he realized that the compound was also associated with severe birth defects in babies, and this birth defect was called phocomelia. And this phocomelia is essentially shortened or absent or flipper-like limbs. And the manufacturer of thalidomide had ignored reports of the birth defects, and it wasn't until a German newspaper wrote about 161 babies that were adversely affected that the distribution was stopped in Germany, and shortly thereafter the entire world. However, interestingly enough, American babies were saved from the thalidomide tragedy because of the work of FDA Inspector Frances Kelsey. She actually refused to approve thalidomide because she did not feel that the company provided sufficient data, and her refusal and like this worldwide tragedy that was seen led Congress and President John F. Kennedy to sign the Kefauver-Harris Amendment in 1962. And now drug companies are not only required to prove safety, but also the efficacy of drugs. And this amendment gave way to the expectations that the pharmaceutical industry is held to today, to prove that drugs are not only safe, but also efficacious, to report adverse reactions to FDA, and to gain informed consent from patients participating in clinical trials. So another piece of legislation that really helped shape the pharmaceutical industry and the way we operate today is the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. So again, to tell you a little bit about what life was like before PDUFA, there was an increase in dissatisfaction from all three kind of stakeholders, we can say. The FDA, the pharmaceutical industry, and consumers all felt that drug approvals took far too long. The average FDA review time was somewhere around 30 months. Consumers were particularly scrutinizing the lengthy approvals due to the rise of the AIDS epidemic. It was a time that AIDS and HIV activist organizations were actually accusing FDA of unnecessarily delaying approval, and it was estimated that thousands of lives were lost each year due to the delays in approval. The pharmaceutical industry was frustrated because the delays meant that there were delays in recuperating the costs of research and development, it was estimated that a 1-month delay resulted in a $10 million loss to the sponsor. And they also expressed skepticism that if they did provide FDA with fees, that they would be used elsewhere rather than to speed drug approvals. FDA, however, argued back that they needed additional staff to end backlogs of the drugs that were awaiting approval for market, and that Congress had really not appropriated sufficient budget to FDA in order for them to hire them back. So the solution to these problems ended in, or what came about through the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which was passed by Congress in 1992. And this legislation is what permitted FDA to collect fees from drug manufacturers at the time of the new drug application submission. So these funds were collected as an application fee, and they were designated towards use in the Center of Drug Evaluation Research for drug approval activities only. And it was only after PDUFA was passed that the FDA and industry agreed on setting target completed timelines for review, and also they agreed that these fees would only supplement congressional appropriations and not replace them entirely. In general, this resulted in a more predictable approval pathway from FDA, more collaboration between sponsors and regulatory, the review and approval timeline decreased, and there was it actually really did revolutionize the way that the pharmaceutical industry conducts their planning for clinical trials, etc. So now PDUFA is reauthorized every 5 years, and the funding allow FDA to increase the number of drug reviewers, which results in faster drug approval times and allows an increase in patient access to new medications. This also, does anyone know by any chance how much the PDUFA fee is today? Just curious. You can feel free to write it in the box. I'll be impressed if you do. So that drug application fee this year is $2 million, around $2.4 million. So sponsors pay a good amount in order to have these fees paid. And back in 1992, I believe the fee was something around $100,000. So it really has exponentially grown. So moving on to my next slide. So hopefully the context that I provided in the beginning helps you understand why regulations are necessary. So for patients and prescribers, it's important that we're providing them with medications that they know and trust to be safe and effective. This is really, in the early 1900s, patients did not trust the medications that were being made available by manufacturers because they were being told that from expose pieces that these were poison and that there were fraudulent ingredients within. So it's really important to patients that there are regulations in place that protect them. For industry and academia, it's important for them to know what health authorities expect so they can provide that accordingly. And for governments, it's important to know whether the benefits of a drug outweigh the potential risks to keep safe the public. So regulatory affairs is a relatively new profession, you can say. I would also call it an ever-evolving profession as it continues to transform in response to regulatory guidelines that come out, new technologies, and an improved understanding of disease states. The Global Regulatory Affairs Group and regulatory professionals play a pivotal role to all other functional groups, and they really are charged with a strong leadership role to ensure that they are not only compliant with regulations, but that they understand the interpretation of this dynamic environment. All the while, it's not just regulatory affairs is not black and white by any means. You're also, as a regulatory affairs professional, looking to create opportunities in this highly regulated and complex environment. And this challenging landscape is attributable to the success of the biopharmaceutical industry as well as the failures of it. With tragedies such as the thalidomide and sulfanilamide, there is a lot of distrust historically surrounding drug companies, and it's important that that these regulations protect the public, and ultimately you are providing the healthy innovative medications to patients. So the scope of regulatory affairs functions spans the entire spectrum of product development, manufacturing, registration, post-marketing activities, and lifecycle optimization. The span of involvement and responsibility is sometimes referred to as bench to bedside or from cradle to grave. And this is kind of unique to regulatory affairs. We're really involved throughout, as early as the beginning in drug discovery to as late as post-marketing. So as I previously mentioned, regulatory affairs works with a wide range of functions within the pharmaceutical industry, internally within the company to make sure that they are all on the same page regarding what is expected from the health authority. And then they also are going to liaise with the health authority to make sure that if there is an opportunity for unique or innovative paths to drug approval, that they are able to get it. So speaking of health authorities, there are multiple health authorities all around the world. Just to name a few, in the United States, we have the Food and Drug Administration. In Brazil, we have the Brazilian Health Surveillance Agency, which is actually referred to as Anvisa. In Europe, we have the European Medicine Agency, which includes, I believe, 27 or 28 member states of the EU. In Japan, there's the Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Agency, or PMDA. And in Australia, there's the Therapeutic Goods Administration. Not on this map are the numerous other agencies or health authorities that exist from each of these countries in each of these regions that all have their own unique set of expectations and guidelines that we must comply with if we are wanting our drug to be registered there and then marketed there and then for us to receive profit from there. So not included on this map is, say, Canada or China, India. All of those have their own regulatory authorities that we must comply with, and we must know the guidelines for as regulatory affairs professionals looking to enter these markets. So FDA is obviously one of the major markets that regulatory affairs professionals work with, and this diagram is kind of supposed to show you where FDA and the industry interacts during development. So you can see that as early as preclinical development, there's the possibility of a pre-IND meeting. And then between preclinical development and phase 1, that's when you're submitting your IND. And then at the end of phase 2A, which is kind of the middle of your phase 2, you have a meeting with FDA at that time as well to make sure that you're on the same page. And there are many other opportunities for meetings as you go along the pathway. And I just like to stress that these aren't necessarily just one meeting. There can be multiple meetings along the way, but these are just some of the more specific ones. So within regulatory, there are a wide range of functions as well. These are some of the names that are listed, but I will go into greater detail with them on the next couple slides. So product strategy, this is the area that I am currently working in. They work to develop and lead global regulatory strategy. They are going to work to coordinate with regional regulatory teams to comply with the global strategy, liaise with regulatory authorities, and review regulatory submissions. So this is the area where you're submitting and preparing INDs, so investigational new drug applications, clinical trial applications, marketing authorizations, new drug applications, and biologic license applications. Lots of acronyms in regulatory. So this is kind of this is what a lot of people think of when they think of regulatory. But it is certainly not the only function within. Next, we have chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. This is one of the rotations that I am currently working on. And this is where you're really analyzing the impact of a manufacturing change on drug products. So CMC works with regulatory strategy closely to communicate changes to health authorities or to discuss how different deviations impact the overall product. And it's a very interesting and complex hard science area of regulatory affairs. Then we have advertising and promotion, where you are going to be responsible for reviewing and evaluating your internal materials for promotion to make sure that they are compliant with what FDA and the FDA deems appropriate. So there are many warning letters that are published online by FDA to show what is inappropriate or what FDA deems inappropriate, so that other companies can be aware of it and they can learn from it. And what's cool about this area is that you're really working closely with legal as well as marketing to make sure that the promotional material is appropriate. So on one of my rotations in pharmacy school, I got the chance to work in advertising and promotion, and one of the things that we reviewed was a Snapchat filter, which I thought was super cool and something that I never would have seen or imagined a regulatory affairs professional to have to worry about. So this review of materials includes tweets on the company Twitter, or oral statements by companies or patient speakers, brochures, booklets, you name it. So within CDER, it is regulated by the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion, or OPDP, and for CBER, the Biologics division at FDA, it's by the Advertising and Promotional Labeling branch. Another function within regulatory is intelligence and policy, and these regulatory professionals are really responsible for monitoring emerging trends, policies, regulations, and guidelines to kind of analyze and communicate these trends to the regulatory strategy team as well as CMC and ad promo. They actually kind of look out for precedents to see what other companies are doing, to see what different health authorities have deemed appropriate or not appropriate, seeing what flexibility they're allowing, kind of provide that intel to the company, as well as kind of formulate a company stance on drug-related policies and lobby on behalf of pharma. So now a lot of you might be wondering, how does a pharmacist fit into regulatory affairs? So I'm here to tell you that in any function of regulatory, a pharmacist has many transferable skills that can be applied, including collaboration, knowing the patient-provider perspective, keeping the patient at the focus, as well as that clinical background. Although there is a lot of science involved in regulatory affairs, knowing the science is really integral to being strategic, to using your analytical skills that you have as a pharmacist, and to providing to the success of your program. And in any area of the industry and in pharmacy, I believe it's important to be a team player. So a pharmacist can really translate to a regulatory affairs professionals with the appropriate amount of training and guidance. So in conclusion, the pharmaceutical industry is highly regulated, as we know through history. The regulatory affairs is an integral function within the pharmaceutical industry. There are multiple functional areas within regulatory affairs, and a pharmacist's background makes them highly suited for a role in regulatory affairs. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll open it up to questions now. So we had a couple that were submitted when people registered. I'll start there. So the first question is, what can I do while in school to allow myself to acquire a career in this field upon graduation? So I can really only speak to the fellowship pathway into regulatory affairs, since this is what I explored and what I've pursued. And I would say that the most important thing to do is try to get experience by getting a summer internship or working or engaging with the pharmaceutical industry in any way that you can. I really do believe that can provide you with valuable experience, as well as if your school offers it, an FDA rotation could be really valuable as well. But for some people that don't have these opportunities, for instance, I went to an accelerated program where I didn't get to necessarily have summers off, so I couldn't do a summer internship. I would say that it's still important to look at FDA guidances, familiarize yourself with the role of regulatory affairs. Attending seminars such as today are particularly helpful, since you get a better understanding of the different functions and the way it works. And at the end of the day, when you're pursuing a fellowship, they don't expect you to know everything. It's a training program for a reason. So in addition to that, I would say being involved, doing well in school, all of the items that I would say you would already know are important. Next I got, how beneficial is a dual MBA PharmD program for pharmacists looking to go into industry as a whole? I can't speak to the benefit of a MBA PharmD program in regulatory affairs. I'm not too sure what the value would be there. I don't believe that it necessarily translates. An MBA, a dual MBA PharmD would translate to regulatory affairs. However, I would say that for different functional areas, it may be more appropriate, such as maybe commercial, but again, I might not be the best person to ask that. I would recommend that you get in touch with a commercial or a HEOR or a payer access fellow. The next question we have is, how did pharmacy school prepare you for your current role? So that's an interesting question. I would say that pharmacy school doesn't necessarily prepare you. It's what you do in addition to gaining that clinical knowledge, what extracurriculars you engage in, what what experiences you take on, what leadership opportunities you have. I think those are, what helped me prepare for a job in the pharmaceutical industry. It's really, a lot of pharmacists don't work traditionally in a corporate environment, and I think that being familiar with that is really helpful to prepare for this. And in general, you can't necessarily prepare to be a regulatory affairs professional, because the marker of success in regulatory affairs is experience, and it's only after you've gained experience working on various products or working on various projects across development that you'll really learn and be prepared to be a regulatory affairs professional. Are there lots of opportunities to apply strategic thinking? Hopefully my presentation shows you this, but I would say absolutely. Between product development as well as chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, to advertising and promotion, to intelligence, there are so many areas where you are going to be applying strategic thinking. A lot of times you have these guidances from different health authorities, but they don't necessarily tell you exactly what you're looking for. Like I said, regulatory has a lot of gray area, and as a result, you need to think analytically, think about how you can best present materials to FDA and or rather any health authority. And also it's kind of like a two-way street. You get to collaborate with them at these meetings along the way. You get to learn what their perspective is and understand how to modify your product strategy or what you're doing accordingly. And some more questions that we're getting right now. So, what can I do while still in pharmacy school to start building a career path towards regulatory affairs? I highly recommend that you get involved in terms of get extracurricular experience, get outside the classroom, do some leadership, engage in some leadership opportunities, maybe start a DIA chapter at your school or join the local chapter. I would just be aware of what's going on in the industry, read up on drug approvals. These are the things, in addition to some of the items earlier that I mentioned, that would be beneficial to start working towards being a competent regulatory affairs person. There's always resources that can be read. There's always people you can talk to individually. So if you know any regulatory affairs professionals, talk to them about what they do in their day-to-day. Talk to fellows as you are today. Get in touch with them. See what area within regulatory you are most interested in. I really believe that those are some of the most helpful things that you can do. As a global regulatory affairs fellow, do you study the specifics of any particular country? So that's a really good question. I work mostly with the US and the European markets. So that is generally the regions that I'm focusing on. However, I have had to work in other markets as well due to the nature of the project that I'm working on at a given time. So if I get feedback from Switzerland, I have to know the Switzerland requirements. If I get feedback from Health Canada on a product, I need to know the Health Canada requirements. It really depends on what you're working on at the time, but generally speaking, you would work on the most major markets, which tend to be US and US and the European market. Are there opportunities for career development in regulatory affairs? Absolutely. The regulatory affairs, like I said, experience. It's what prepares you to succeed in regulatory and to climb that ladder higher and higher. So there are always opportunities for career development, as well as there's numerous materials and opportunities within regulatory affairs to learn new things. And I'd really like to stress that this is an evolving environment. So you are constantly kind of on your toes to see what changes are happening globally. Someone asks, what are pressing issues in industry regulations at this time that students can bring attention to? That's a good question. I would say that in the US, there's a lot of talk regarding rare diseases and kind of a change in legislation. So I would really explore that arena of policy and of legislation that is happening. Kind of try to understand why maybe FDA is more lenient right now, if they are more lenient. I'm not necessarily giving you the answer because I think it's beneficial for you to get out there and research it, but kind of evaluate what's going on in regards to if the FDA is being more flexible with regulations right now or less flexible. I highly recommend you look at Sarepta Pharmaceuticals' most recent drug approval. I think that's an interesting precedent that was set in a unique case, a unique drug approval. So definitely check that out. Someone asks, is regulatory affairs beneficial in the public and private job market? I mean, certainly it's, and if by private you mean working within the pharmaceutical industry, that's what I'm considering private. I would say that certainly there are many opportunities, and in regards to public, I don't necessarily know if there are, if you're referring to working in health authorities such as the FDA, but I would say that they wouldn't necessarily be called regulatory affairs professionals if they work at the FDA. So I don't think I fully understand that question. Someone asks, how easy, hard is it to switch across functions when starting out in regulatory, for example, going to ClinOps? I honestly would not know how to answer that because I have never tried, nor have I personally had an interest in that. So I would think that there are, as long as you have transferable skills, switching to other functions would not be impossible by any means. To work after graduation as entry-level regulatory affairs specialist, do we need to do specific internships or fellowships? Obviously, fellowship is not the only way to get into the pharmaceutical industry. However, I do want you to be aware. I just think it's fair of me to say that in order to be an entry-level regulatory affairs professional, you will need to have some knowledge of regulatory. You will need to have some knowledge of or experience with submissions. So I do believe that there is some sort of an internship or a fellowship or some sort of experience is within regulatory specifically is helpful before getting an entry-level position. So whether that be you work with like a CRO or whether you pursue your master's in regulatory affairs, it can really range. But I do believe that pharmacy school in itself is not necessarily sufficient to garner you a entry-level job in regulatory affairs, unless you have like internship experience, which I totally believe that some people are able to do. I have a rotation in advertising and promotion and wonder if any skills learned in this position are transferable to other functions such as marketing. I would ask someone in marketing, see what the essential skills of that position or of that function are, and see what you learned and attained while you were in that rotation and how they can be transferred. I would say that I'm sure that there are, but that would be my advice to you. Do you have any tips for the fellowship process? I do have many. However, we will have a future webinar series where we will discuss more about our fellowship in itself at large and the process. So I would say that attend that. That's going to be my tip. How many areas of regulatory do you get to rotate in your fellowship? So my particular fellowship has the opportunity to rotate in product strategy, chemistry, manufacturing and controls, intelligence and policy, labeling, and advertising and promotion. So over the course of 2 years, you do have the opportunity to rotate through any number of those departments. I personally have my heart is set on product strategy, so I am spending most of my time in that function, but I also have had the opportunity to complete a CMC rotation, chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. I have also had the chance to, or I will have the chance to rotate through labeling, and I've worked with operations nearly since the beginning of my fellowship, so I also feel like I've done that a little bit. So honestly, the organization of each company is different, which allows for different opportunities within the rotations. So that's just what my experience and my interests. What are the job outlooks after fellowship? They are good. I generally see, it seems as though they're always hiring regulatory affairs professionals. So I believe that they are good, but I'll let you know when I finish my fellowship. What are some personal skills that you think are relevant to being a regulatory affairs professional? I believe that critical thinking, strategy, analytical thinking, collaboration, writing and speaking skills are essential to being a regulatory affairs professional. What projects are you currently working on? I am working on many awesome projects. I work on a product in phase 2/3, which is a rare disease product that is really unique. It has orphan designation, so we're working on an expedited timeline, and I get to not only see the product strategy side of it, but also the chemistry, manufacturing, and control side of it. So I get to see what the how the two impact each other, how the two impact the timeline, the challenges related to product strategy. It's really an interesting area. That's just one of the projects I work on. I also work on a post-marketed product, working on maintaining the product's application, as well as the post-marketing commitments related to the product. And I have many, many more projects that if I was to talk about, we would be here all night. When deciding on which company to do your fellowship, what are some things that you did what are some things did you take into consideration? So some things that I took into consideration while deciding on my company were, it's different for everyone. I was looking for a global experience. That was one of the items, as well as I was looking for a strong fellow network. I was looking for buy-in from upper management. So there's a wide range of items that I was looking at. If there are any questions, will you provide us with your email at the conclusion of this webinar? I will write it in the chat box so you guys can have it. Despite the complexity of your fellowship, do you find the time to have a well-rounded life? I would say absolutely. It's definitely, I want to take advantage of this time that I am in the fellowship, but by no means is it preventing me from having a well-rounded life. I would say you choose what you want to focus on. So yes, right now I might be working on work more, but it's not necessarily inhibiting me from having a life. And also I think that once you've gone through pharmacy school in general, you know how to balance your time a little bit better, hopefully, and you, I personally feel that school is not as difficult as work is ever. Well, maybe that's just me. Will you travel outside the country during your fellowship? So it really depends on what's going on with your product at the moment. My co-fellow last year did have the opportunity to go to multiple European agency meetings. So it depends. I would say that at Sanofi, they do try to get you opportunities with health authority meetings. So there is always, the answer is really, it depends. It depends on what product you're working on, what's going on with that product, etc. When we're preparing for fellowships, how in-depth are we expected to know about a company's pipeline? I would say that answer depends company to company. I don't think all companies require you to have vast knowledge of their products and pipeline. However, I would hate to tell you that this isn't important and then you get asked it during an interview. So I would say that if I were you, I would just kind of create like a flashcard to review each of the company's products or what's going on in their pipeline specifically. And that way, you're prepared for that part. I mean, I wouldn't say that a company is generally going to ask you specifically about a particular product, but I mean, anything's possible, and all companies range in what they expect from their applicants. So I'm sorry I can't be of more help there. So why did you decide on regulatory affairs? I think that for me, regulatory affairs was an area that there was the intersection of government and regulation as well as science, and those are two of my passions. So I think it was an area that I felt I could put together my passions, and as well as I think that the dynamic of the role, with its focus on an appropriate amount of independent work as well as the team dynamic, allowed it to be something appropriate for me. So those are some of the reasons that I decided on regulatory. And if there are no more questions, I'm going to end this call or the webinar. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to type them now. And if you do and you didn't get to, if I didn't get to answer them, I didn't see them, or you think of them later, feel free to email me. I have provided my email in the chat box, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. It was great to speak with you all tonight. I wish you guys the best of luck in your career, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Have a great evening, everyone.